What does it take for a story to survive through generations? For some, it's a tale of triumph, a story retold because it inspires. But for others, it is tragedy etched into the memory of a community, not because it offers hope, but because it lingers like a ghost, unanswered and unresolved. And sometimes, those stories become so clouded by time, rumor, and silence that we are left wondering, what really happened? The story of Mary Timney is one of those cases. A chilling and haunting tale that unfolded in 19th century Scotland, but still echoes even today. Hers was a death that shocked her community, a crime so disturbing that newspapers of the time described it in almost hushed tones, as if even they weren't quite sure how to explain what had happened. But beyond the headlines, beyond the official records, there are still questions that leave us staring into the fog of history, wondering what truth, if any, has been left behind. Mary Timney was not a name that would have been familiar to most people in her lifetime. She was not wealthy, not a woman of power, and certainly not someone who would have expected her name to be remembered nearly 2 centuries later. And yet, because of the way she died and the way her death was handled, her story refuses to fade quietly into the past. At its surface, this seems like a straightforward crime, a violent act, a victim, and a punishment that would follow swiftly in a society determined to make an example out of her. But if we look a little closer, if we peel back the layers of what people said, of how the press reported it, and of what the justice system decided, we begin to see something else. Was this truly the crime it appeared to be? Or was Mary Timney's story shaped by forces larger than her forces of class, of gender, of power? The more we look at this case, the more unsettling it becomes. It isn't just about the crime itself, but about what that crime reveals about the time in which it happened, about the society that surrounded Mary, and about the way justice was carried out, or perhaps the way it failed. So tonight, we step back into the world of 1839, into the quiet rural setting where Mary lived, worked, and eventually met her end. We'll follow her life, the day everything changed, the trial that followed, and the haunting legacy that still lingers long after. And along the way, we'll ask the questions that history itself seems reluctant to answer. Was Mary Timney truly guilty of the crime for which she was condemned? Or was she a victim of circumstance, a chilling tale lost to time? To understand the disturbing death of Mary Timney, we first need to understand who she was in life. And that part of the story, like so many tales from the early 19th century, is difficult to piece together. Ordinary people, especially women of modest means, rarely left behind detailed records of their lives. Their voices are often missing from the historical record. What survives are fragments, court documents, brief mentions in newspapers, and the memories of neighbors who spoke of her long after her death. But if we listen closely to those fragments, a picture begins to emerge. Mary Timney was a woman of rural Scotland, living in the early 1800s in a world defined by hard work, rigid social rules, and limited opportunities. Life in those small villages was not glamorous. It was survival. For women like Mary, survival often meant long days of labor, whether in the fields, at the hearth, or in service to others. Yet even within this world of hardship, there are whispers that Mary was known for her resilience, and for a personality that left an impression on those around her. Some accounts suggest that Mary was a motherly figure, someone who carried the burdens of daily life with a kind of stoic strength. Friends remembered her as practical, sharp-tongued at times, but deeply protective of those she loved. In a community where everyone knew one another's business, Mary's presence would not have gone unnoticed. She was a woman who had endured hardship, but had not let it break her. But this is where her story begins to twist. Because while some remembered her with kindness, others described her differently. There were those who saw her as difficult, even confrontational, and perhaps in a time and place where women were expected to be quiet and obedient. A woman who spoke her mind, who stood her ground, would always be seen as difficult. It raises an unsettling question. Did the way people perceived Mary, the way they judged her character, play a role in how her story ended? We know that Mary's life was not free from struggle. Accounts point to disputes with neighbors, tensions that seemed small in the moment, but may have carried lasting consequences. She was not wealthy, and like many women of her class, she had little power or protection when disagreements turned into conflicts. And yet, despite this, she continued to live her life as best as she could, raising children, keeping a household, and surviving in a world that often left women like her with very little support. It's worth pausing here, because this is where history becomes more than just names and dates. It becomes human. Imagine Mary walking the dirt roads of her village, her dress worn from use, her hands rough from work. Imagine her balancing her daily responsibilities while carrying the quiet weight of knowing that in her society, one misstep, one accusation could change everything. That vulnerability is something we can all understand, even nearly 2 centuries later, and perhaps that's what makes this case so haunting. Because Mary's life, in so many ways, was ordinary. She lived, she struggled, she fought for her place in a world that was not built to protect her. Yet her fate was anything but ordinary. Her life ended violently, in a way that not only shocked her community, but also set her apart in history as one of the last women in Scotland to be executed. When friends and neighbors later spoke of Mary, their words carried the weight of hindsight. Some said she was a victim of her own temper, a woman whose fiery personality placed her in conflict too often. Others insisted she had been misunderstood, her story twisted by rumor and judgment until the truth was lost. And still, others remained silent, perhaps unwilling to speak too openly about a crime that had left the entire community uneasy. But maybe that silence says as much as the words. Maybe it reminds us that Mary's life, like so many lives, cannot be fully captured by the records left behind. All we can do is piece together the fragments and wonder what kind of woman she truly was, what kind of mother, what kind of neighbor, what kind of soul. And yet, the irony is chilling. For all the quiet resilience of her daily life, for all the struggles and small triumphs that defined her existence, Mary Timney would not be remembered for the woman she was. She would be remembered for the way she died. And that, perhaps, is the greatest tragedy of all. It was an ordinary day. At least, that's how it began. And isn't that so often the way with tragedies? No one wakes up knowing that the hours ahead will decide the course of their life. For Mary Timney, that day seemed to carry the weight of every hardship she had endured. Arguments had been simmering in the background for weeks, perhaps months. Neighbors had spoken of tensions, small disputes over property lines, over livestock, or over matters that seem trivial to us now, but in tight-knit rural communities of the 1800s, such disputes could fester into something far darker. On that day, in 1839, Mary's steps led her toward the home of her neighbor, a woman with whom she had a troubled relationship. Accounts differ on the exact cause of their conflict. Some say it was over land, others claim it was personal grievances, whispers of insults traded back and forth. Whatever the cause, it had built into a resentment that could not be ignored. That morning, Mary set out, perhaps intending to confront, perhaps intending only to speak her mind. But what happened next would change everything. The encounter between Mary and her neighbor quickly escalated. Some witnesses claimed harsh words were exchanged. Others insisted that Mary appeared agitated even before she arrived. Still, others suggested that the neighbor had provoked her, pushing Mary into a confrontation she could not step back from. The truth may never be fully known. But what we do know is that in a moment of anger, fueled by frustration and desperation, Mary acted violently, It is said that she attacked her neighbor with a weapon, a brutal act that would leave the other woman fatally injured. The details are grim, even by the standards of historical reporting. Some accounts describe a sudden, frenzied moment, others a deliberate act carried out in cold blood. And yet, woven into those accounts is uncertainty. Was this truly an act of calculated malice, or was it a moment of unrestrained rage? For those who heard the cries or arrived in the aftermath, the scene must have been one of horror. A quiet village afternoon shattered by violence. People rushing to the source of the commotion, only to find a neighbor someone they had shared meals with, prayed alongside, and lived among lying injured, her life slipping away. And beside her, Mary, a woman they thought they knew, caught in the terrible reality of what she had done. Could anyone have predicted what was about to happen? That a dispute which might have seemed ordinary by village standards would end in such irreversible tragedy? Or was this, in some way, inevitable the result of years of strain, a woman cornered by circumstance, lashing out in the only way she felt she could? As word spread, the community was gripped by shock. The village, accustomed to the rhythms of work and worship, found itself consumed by whispers of murder. For many, it was unthinkable. Violence of this kind was rare, and for it to come from someone within their own circle, someone they saw every day, made it all the more unsettling. Mary did not flee. Some say she stood in stunned silence. Others claim she admitted outright what she had done. Perhaps she knew that escape was impossible. Perhaps she felt the weight of inevitability pressing down upon her in that moment. What is clear is that the authorities were quickly called, and Mary was taken into custody. It is here that the story shifts from tragedy to something even darker. Because while Mary had committed a crime, one that would carry severe consequences in any age, the way her case was handled would set it apart. Within hours, her fate was no longer her own. She was swept into a system that had little patience for nuance, little interest in understanding the context of her life. A crime had been committed, and someone had to pay. Looking back, we are left with haunting questions. Was this the inevitable result of Mary's fiery temperament, as some neighbors claimed? Or was it a single moment of rage, magnified by the unforgiving lens of her community and the justice system of her time? Could the tragedy have been prevented if someone had stepped in earlier, if words had replaced violence? What remains undeniable is this. On that day, Mary Timney crossed a line from which there was no return. Her life, once defined by struggle and resilience, became defined instead by a single act. And in the hours that followed, her name would begin its descent into infamy, remembered not for who she was, but for what she had done. When the crime was first discovered, it sent shockwaves through the small Scottish community where Mary Timney lived. In villages like hers, life followed a steady rhythm: work in the fields, gossip at the market, sermons on Sunday. Violence of this kind was not just rare. It was almost unthinkable. And yet, here it was, playing out in front of their very eyes. Neighbors recalled hearing raised voices. The sudden shattering of calm, it seemed to pierce the ordinary quiet of the day. By the time villagers rushed to the scene, it was too late. The victim lay gravely wounded, and the air was thick with panic and disbelief. People gathered in small clusters, whispering in tones that mixed both fear and outrage. How could something like this happen here, in a place where everyone knew each other? How could it be Mary, the woman who had walked these roads, spoken in these homes, and shared in the same simple existence as all of them? The town that once felt safe was now cloaked in fear. The sense of familiarity, the trust that bound neighbors together, had been shattered. For the first time, many looked at their surroundings and saw not comfort but suspicion. If Mary could do this, who else was capable of violence? The authorities were summoned almost immediately. In the 1830s, policing in rural Scotland was still a rudimentary affair. But even so, Crimes of this magnitude demanded swift action. Constables arrived, taking statements, piecing together what had happened from the frightened words of witnesses. They found Mary at the scene, and according to some reports, she made little effort to deny her involvement. Some said she appeared calm, resigned even. Others described her as defiant, unwilling to cower in the face of what she knew was coming. It's a detail worth pausing on. What must have been going through her mind in those moments? Was she aware that her life, in effect, had already ended, that society would never forgive or forget what she had done? Or was she, in her own way, still clinging to some hope that she might explain, that others might see what had led her to this terrible act? As word of the crime spread beyond the immediate village, the press began to take notice. Local newspapers carried the story, framing it as both shocking and sensational. Readers across Scotland would have encountered Mary's name in stark, accusatory print, a woman charged with murder. And in a time when women were expected to embody quiet obedience, her crime was painted not only as brutal, but unnatural. It wasn't just that she had killed. It was that she, a woman, had killed with such violence. For the community left behind, the aftermath was heavy with unease. The victim's family mourned, struggling to reconcile their grief with the public spectacle the case was becoming. Mary's own family faced shame and fear, their lives upended by association. And for the villagers who had known both women, there was a kind of collective mourning, not only for the life that had been lost, but for the innocence of a community now forever marked by tragedy. This was not the kind of story that would fade quietly. Instead, it spread, drawing curious onlookers, shaping public opinion before Mary's trial had even begun. Every retelling seemed to magnify the horror, painting Mary in darker and darker shades. The woman who had once been a neighbor was now a villain, her humanity overshadowed by the narrative of her crime. And yet, as with all tragedies, not everyone agreed. There were whispers, small, quiet voices that suggested the story wasn't so simple. Some said Mary had been provoked, that she had long been pushed to her breaking point. Others wondered if the justice system would truly give her a fair chance, or if she had already been condemned in the eyes of society. These questions lingered, quietly debated in hushed tones, even as the official machinery of law began to turn against her. Still, the overwhelming atmosphere was one of dread. The village had been fractured, the community's spirit poisoned by fear and suspicion. Children were hushed at the mention of Mary's name. Neighbors avoided eye contact, uncertain of what to say or how to feel. And through it all, the victim's absence hung heavy in the air, a reminder that no matter what explanations or justifications might come, a life had been taken, and nothing could undo that. It is in this atmosphere, this mixture of grief, fear, and a thirst for justice, that the stage was set for what would follow. Mary Timney was no longer just a woman of the village. She was a figure of public scrutiny, her fate no longer in her own hands. And as the authorities prepared to bring her to trial, the community braced itself for a reckoning it could neither avoid nor forget. The investigation into the death of Mary Timney's neighbor began almost immediately. In a community where everyone knew one another, the crime was not the kind of mystery that demanded long weeks of searching for clues. The supposed culprit had been identified at the scene, and by the next morning, whispers had already hardened into accusations. To the authorities, the case must have seemed deceptively simple. A woman, caught in the aftermath of violence, standing over her victim. But as we take a closer look, we begin to see that simplicity was perhaps an illusion. The constables collected statements from witnesses, each of whom seemed eager or perhaps pressured to contribute their version of events. Some claimed that Mary had approached her neighbor's home already agitated, her voice carrying sharp tones that spoke of anger long held. Others swore that the victim herself had been the one to provoke Mary, hurling insults that stirred the fire into flame. And then there were those who admitted They had not seen the confrontation at all, but had merely heard about it from others. Their words, passed along like echoes in a narrow corridor, may have distorted into something far more damning by the time they reached the ears of investigators. Physical evidence, as we would expect in the early 19th century, was rudimentary. There were no forensic tests, no meticulous crime scene reconstructions. What investigators had was the body of the victim, the weapon said to have been used, and Mary herself. The weapon, a household tool, according to some accounts, was presented as proof of Mary's intent. It was not unusual for such items to be within reach in a domestic setting. Yet in the context of the crime, it became something sinister. An object transformed into an emblem of guilt, but here lies the troubling reality. Evidence in cases like Mary's often leaned heavily on perception, not proof. Was the weapon truly wielded with murderous intent, or was it grasped in the heat of a quarrel, a tragic escalation rather than a calculated act? Without the kind of scientific clarity available to us today, the interpretation of those details fell squarely into the hands of authorities, who may have already made up their minds. And what of suspects? In truth, there were none, at least, none the authorities seemed willing to consider. From the very first moment, Mary was both witness and accused, her identity as the neighbor's adversary, sealing her fate before the investigation had even unfolded. Yet, if we step back and ask the uncomfortable questions, we must wonder, was it possible that others bore some responsibility? Could the victim herself, through repeated provocation or conflict, have contributed to the escalation? Could neighbors, aware of ongoing disputes, have intervened sooner? These are not excuses, but they are questions worth asking. Still, in the official narrative, there was no room for such complexity. Mary was the suspect, and the only suspect. The investigation did not seem to branch into alternative theories, nor did it appear to probe the deeper social fabric that might have fueled the tragedy. Instead, it narrowed to a single conclusion. A woman had committed murder, and justice would need to be swift and severe. But even within this one-track investigation, conflicting accounts emerged. Some described Mary as frenzied, out of control, consumed by rage at the moment of the crime. Others painted a different picture of a woman who, even after the act, seemed calm, collected, almost resigned. Which version was true? Could Mary have been both, a storm in one moment and eerily composed in the next? Or had the retelling of her actions been shaped by the expectations of the time, by a society eager to label her as monstrous? Another layer of complexity was the press. Newspapers of the era thrived on sensational stories, and a woman committing murder was headline material. Reports began to frame Mary not simply as a criminal, but as a cautionary tale. To the public, she was described as a figure of warning. What could happen when a woman stepped outside the boundaries of obedience and submission? Was this truly objective reporting, or was it narrative building, designed to sell papers and reaffirm social norms? These accounts matter because they influence not only public perception, but also the trajectory of the investigation. A community already reeling from shock now saw its worst fears reflected and magnified in print. Mary's image hardened into something unrecognizable, less a neighbor, more a symbol of danger. And when that happens, how much room is left for doubt? Yet the question still lingered. Did the evidence truly point to Mary, or did it merely serve the story others wanted to tell? It is easy, in hindsight, to assume guilt from the simple fact of her presence at the scene. But presence does not always mean culpability, and intent is far harder to prove than action. Was this a murder in cold blood, as the papers described? Or was it a moment of heated conflict that spiraled tragically beyond control? In the end, the investigation presented a case as straightforward as it was damning. Mary Timney, armed with a weapon, had struck her neighbor and ended her life. It was the kind of story the courts could easily digest, the kind of narrative a community could cling to when the alternative ambiguity was too unsettling to bear. And so, the stage was set for Mary's trial. A trial that would not only determine her fate, but would also reveal just how much weight society placed on perception over truth, and punishment over understanding. The trial of Mary Timney was as swift as it was decisive. In an age when justice was expected to move quickly, cases of murder rarely lingered in the courts for long. For Mary, there would be little reprieve, no drawn-out process of appeals or delays. Instead, she was thrust almost immediately from accusation into the harsh glare of judgment. Her fate unfolding not just inside the courtroom, but also in the pages of the press and the whispers of the public. The courtroom itself was a place of tension. Reporters described the proceedings with dramatic flair, shaping every gesture, every word spoken by Mary or her accusers into something symbolic. To them, this was not just a trial of a single woman. It was a stage play in which morality, gender, and social order were on trial as well. Mary sat in the dock, her presence scrutinized by all. Some accounts claimed she appeared hardened, even unrepentant. Others suggested she looked pale and weary, carrying the weight of her crime and the inevitability of her sentence. Which of these descriptions was true is difficult to know, but what matters is how they were perceived. To the court, and to the wider society that followed her case, Mary's demeanor was not just evidence, it was a narrative tool. The prosecution presented a straightforward story. Mary had quarreled with her neighbor. The dispute had escalated. She had seized a weapon, and she had used it with fatal consequence. There was little room offered for context, no acknowledgement of the tensions that had simmered in the community, or the possibility that provocation had played a role. The jury was told they must see the act for what it was: deliberate, violent, and punishable by the severest of measures. The defense, limited in both time and resources, had little ground to stand on. Without the benefit of modern legal protections, Mary's advocates could do little more than plead for mercy, pointing to her difficult circumstances and her role as a woman who had struggled against hardship. But these arguments fell flat in a courtroom already primed to see her as guilty. Outside the trial, the media fed the public imagination. Newspapers framed Mary as both monstrous and cautionary, their words dripping with sensationalism. She was painted as a woman who had broken not only the law, but also the natural order. For a society that viewed women as caretakers and nurturers, her crime was more than a murder. It was a betrayal of expectation. She was not just a killer. She was an unnatural killer. And perhaps what shocked people most wasn't just the crime, but what it revealed about society at the time. Because in their reaction to Mary, we see less of a woman on trial and more of a culture eager to reinforce its boundaries. The message was clear: step outside the roles society prescribes, and the consequences will be swift, public, and merciless. The public devoured these portrayals. Stories of Mary's unnatural rage spread from village to city, from whispered rumor to printed word. In drawing rooms and taverns alike, people debated not just her guilt, but what her crime said about the dangers of women unchecked by obedience. The trial was no longer about Mary's actions. It had become a symbol, a spectacle. By the time the verdict was read, there was little surprise. Mary Timney was found guilty of murder. The sentence was death. And in that moment, her fate was sealed not just by the evidence, but by the power of narrative. Yet even here, in the certainty of the court's decision, shadows of doubt linger. Was the punishment proportionate to the crime? Was the sentence truly about justice? Or was it about making an example of Mary, using her life as a warning to others? If Mary had been a man, would the press have treated her with the same mix of horror and fascination? Or was it precisely because she was a woman, because she defied expectations, that her story became so sensational? The trial revealed as much about the society of 19th century Scotland as it did about Mary herself. It was a society that prized order, that demanded conformity, and that used the machinery of justice not only to punish crime, but to reinforce its own values. And in that way, Mary's trial was never just about her. It was about everyone who lived within that rigid system. As the gavel fell and the courtroom emptied, Mary's name was etched into history. Not for her life, not for her struggles, not for the complexity of who she was, but for the single act that sealed her fate, and for the way society chose to remember it. When the verdict was handed down and Mary Timney's execution carried out, many might have believed the case was closed. Justice, by the standards of the 19th century, had been served. Yet in the quiet that followed, questions began to stir, questions that have never fully been answered, and perhaps never can be. One of the most persistent mysteries lies in motive. On the surface, the crime seemed simple enough. An argument between neighbors spiraled out of control, culminating in tragedy. But was it truly that straightforward? Accounts differ on what exactly sparked the final confrontation. Some say it was a petty dispute over boundaries and long-standing resentments. Others insist that deeper grievances, perhaps tied to social status, money, or personal betrayal, lay beneath the surface. The truth, like so much of Mary's story, remains clouded, and then there is the matter of Mary herself. Who was she in those final moments before the crime? Was she acting out of rage, or desperation, or fear? Eyewitness testimony from the period was colored by bias, with neighbors and townsfolk often eager to present her as unstable, dangerous, or morally corrupt. But were these portrayals genuine reflections of her state of mind, or were they convenient narratives designed to justify the severity of her punishment? Speculation has also arisen about the fairness of her trial. Was Mary given a genuine chance to defend herself, or was her fate sealed from the very beginning? Some historians argue that her case reflected less about her guilt and more about the anxieties of a society uneasy with women who transgressed social norms. In that sense, the trial may have been less about a single act of violence and more about restoring order, a public demonstration that anyone, regardless of circumstance, who stepped outside the boundaries of expectation would be punished with the utmost severity. There are also lingering doubts about whether Mary's death sentence was proportionate. Executions, particularly of women, were relatively rare by the mid-19th century. Some contemporaries even questioned the wisdom of carrying out such a harsh penalty. Was Mary's execution meant to be a deterrent, a message to the community? Or was it a decision driven by fear, amplified by sensational media coverage and public outrage? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, what did Mary herself think in her final hours? Did she accept her fate, believing the punishment was inevitable? Or did she go to the gallows carrying resentment, insisting even to herself that she had been wronged by circumstance, by neighbors, by the very society that condemned her? Her voice, like so many others in history, has been lost. What remains are fragments, letters, testimonies, reports, each one tinted by the perspectives of others, never her own. In the years that followed, Mary's story faded from the headlines, but not from memory. In her community, her name lingered like a shadow, tied not to her life, but to her death. Some whispered her tale as a warning, while others repeated it as a ghost story, a chilling reminder of how swiftly life could unravel. Modern readers might look back and wonder, could things have been different? If Mary's case had unfolded today, with forensic evidence, psychological evaluations, and a more nuanced understanding of mental health and domestic conflict, would the outcome have been the same? Or would her story have been one of rehabilitation rather than execution? And yet, for all these questions, the trail runs cold. The documents that remain only hint at the truth. The voices of those who knew her are long silenced. The motives, the emotions, the hidden layers of her story are buried beneath time. And so, decades later, the truth remains just out of reach. Mary Timney's life and death continue to linger, suspended between fact and speculation, justice and injustice. What really happened on that fateful day may never be fully known. All we are left with is a haunting reminder of how fragile truth can be, and how easily it can slip through our grasp. And so, the story of Mary Timney lingers like a shadow in history, unsettling, tragic, and never fully resolved. Her life and death remind us how quickly ordinary moments can descend into something unthinkable, and how easily the truth can become tangled in silence and speculation. But what do you think? Have you heard of this case before, or does it strike you as one of those forgotten tragedies that time has quietly buried? I'd love to hear your thoughts, your theories, and even your questions in the comments below. If you found this case haunting, consider subscribing to the channel for more quiet investigations into forgotten crimes, chilling mysteries, and stories that still echo through history. Each week, we revisit another tale that deserves to be remembered, not with sensationalism, but with care, respect, and a search for understanding. Thank you, as always, for watching, for listening, and for reflecting with me. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.